When my nephew came to stay with us, I never expected his presence to change everything. But it did, and in ways I couldn't have imagined. What happens when a fleeting connection threatens to unravel years of trust and stability? Can a marriage survive the ultimate betrayal? Before we dive into this deeply emotional and unforgettable story, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating tales like this one. And let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. The door creaked open, and there he stood, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. My heart leapt into my throat, every nerve in my body frozen as I realized the implications of his presence. My nephew, standing there, had just seen me in a moment I couldn't explain away, a moment I couldn't take back. His voice caught in his throat, and the only sound in the room was the ticking of the kitchen clock. But how did we get here? It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was a respectable woman, the kind who prided herself on keeping her life orderly, predictable, and perfectly safe. At 50, I had learned how to navigate the slow erosion of time, accepting the fine lines around my eyes, the softening of my once firm silhouette. My marriage to Richard was stable, though no longer passionate. We shared quiet dinners, exchanged pleasantries, and existed side by side like cohabitants in a shared history rather than lovers. When my nephew Jason called to say he needed a place to stay for the summer, I hadn't hesitated. He was family, and family came first. I assured Richard it would be no trouble. Jason was 25, recently graduated, and in need of a change of scenery while figuring out his next steps. Hosting him seemed harmless. At least, it had at the time. Act 1, Part 2. Introducing key characters. 1,000 words. Jason arrived on a bright June morning, his car packed with mismatched boxes and secondhand furniture that wouldn't fit into the apartment he had just vacated. As he climbed out of his car, the first thing I noticed was how much he had grown. Gone was the lanky boy who used to visit us during Christmas holidays. In his place was a young man with a confidence that made him seem older than his years. "Uncle," he said, his voice warm as he wrapped me in a firm hug. "Thanks for letting me crash here." "It's no trouble at all," I replied, trying to ignore the way his cologne, something clean and woodsy, lingered after he let go. Jason was easy company from the start. He moved into the spare room without fuss, unpacking his things with an efficiency that made me think he was used to living out of boxes. He quickly fell into our routine, joining Richard and me for dinner in the evenings and helping with household chores. At first, I barely noticed how much I enjoyed having him around. He filled the house with an energy that had been missing for years. He asked questions about my day, helped me carry groceries, and even fixed the creaky door to the backyard that Richard had been promising to look at for months. It was nice, having someone who noticed me, who cared about the small details. Richard, on the other hand, barely seemed to register Jason's presence. Work kept him late most nights, and when he was home, he was buried in his phone or glued to the television. I couldn't remember the last time we had a meaningful conversation. We coexisted in comfortable silence, both too tired or too afraid to address the growing distance between us. Jason's attention felt like a lifeline. It started innocently enough. He would compliment my cooking or tease me about my penchant for reruns of old mystery shows. "I don't know how you can watch this stuff," he'd say with a laugh, settling onto the couch beside me. "The killer's always the butler." "And yet you're still watching," I'd retort, enjoying the banter more than I cared to admit. The first time I caught myself lingering on him, on the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, or the way his shirt clung to his broad shoulders, I felt a pang of guilt. He was my nephew, for God's sake. It was inappropriate, wrong even, to notice such things. But the thoughts came unbidden, and the harder I tried to push them away, the more they seemed to stick. Jason, for his part, was always kind, always attentive. When Richard's absences stretched longer, Jason was the one who kept me company. He'd pour us each a glass of wine after dinner, and we'd sit on the back porch talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his struggles finding a job, his failed relationship with a college girlfriend, and his dreams of traveling the world. I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't with anyone in years. I told him about my frustrations with Richard, my fears about getting older, and my regrets over all the things I'd left undone. "You're too hard on yourself," he said one evening, his gaze steady and sincere. "You're amazing, Aunt Claire. I hope you know that." His words stayed with me, replaying in my mind long after I had gone to bed. Over the weeks, our bond deepened in ways I couldn't quite define. There were moments when the air between us seemed to shift, small, fleeting moments that left me questioning whether I had imagined them. A brush of his hand against mine as he passed me a plate. The way his eyes lingered just a second too long when I caught him looking at me. It was harmless, I told myself, just a product of spending too much time together. But a part of me, a part I wasn't ready to acknowledge, wondered if there was something more. And then came the moment that changed everything. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon, the kind where the heat pressed down like a heavy blanket and the whole world seemed to move in slow motion. Jason and I were in the kitchen, preparing lunch while Richard worked in his office. I had just finished chopping vegetables when Jason reached over to grab a dish from the counter. His hand brushed against mine, and the contact sent a jolt through me. "Sorry," he said, his voice low. But when I looked up, his eyes held something I couldn't quite name, something that made my breath catch in my throat. "It's fine," I said, stepping back quickly. But the moment lingered, hanging between us like a question neither of us dared to ask. That night, as I lay in bed beside my sleeping husband, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About him. The sound of Jason's laughter floated through the open window, pulling me out of my thoughts. I glanced outside to see him standing by the garden, shirtless, sweat glistening on his skin as he wrestled with a particularly stubborn patch of weeds. My stomach tightened involuntarily, and I immediately scolded myself for letting my thoughts wander where they shouldn't. It wasn't the first time I had caught myself noticing him in ways that made me uncomfortable. In the weeks since he'd moved in, the boundaries of our relationship had begun to blur. We weren't just aunt and nephew anymore, not in the way we talked, the way we laughed, or the way we spent time together. But I told myself it was all innocent. Jason was just a sweet, attentive young man, and I was overanalyzing everything. It was my imagination playing tricks on me, filling the void left by Richard's absence. That had to be it. And yet the moments kept piling up, small and seemingly inconsequential, but impossible to ignore. One evening, after a long day of errands, I came home to find Jason in the kitchen. He had cooked dinner, a simple pasta dish with a salad on the side, and the table was already set. "Lisa?" I asked, surprised. "You've been running around all day," he said with a shrug. "I thought you could use a break." The gesture was thoughtful, kind, exactly the sort of thing Richard used to do when we were first married. I felt a lump rise in my throat as I sat down. Jason poured us each a glass of wine, and we ate together, chatting easily about our day. As we finished our meal, Jason leaned back in his chair, his gaze lingering on me in a way that felt far too intimate. "You should let yourself relax more, Aunt Claire," he said softly. "You deserve it." I couldn't meet his eyes. "I'm fine," I replied, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. A few days later, I was folding laundry in the living room when Jason walked in, freshly showered and wearing nothing but a pair of loose-fitting sweatpants. He flopped onto the couch with a contented sigh, his damp hair falling into his eyes. "You're gonna get water all over the furniture," I teased, trying to keep my tone light. He grinned at me, that boyish smile that always seemed to disarm me. "I'll survive your wrath." I rolled my eyes, but my heart was pounding. I couldn't ignore the way his presence filled the room, the way my pulse quickened when his knee brushed against mine as he reached for the remote. It was nothing, I told myself again, just harmless moments between family. But those moments were starting to feel less and less harmless. Then came the night when everything shifted. Richard was away on a business trip, leaving the house unusually quiet. Jason and I decided to watch a movie, settling onto the couch with a bowl of popcorn between us. I told myself it was no different than the nights we had spent together before, but something about the atmosphere. As the movie played, I became acutely aware of Jason's proximity. The couch wasn't particularly large, and we were sitting closer than we probably should have been. At one point, our hands brushed as we both reached for the popcorn. He didn't pull away immediately, and neither did I. The contact sent a shiver up my spine, and I quickly withdrew, pretending to adjust the blanket draped over my lap. Jason glanced at me, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You okay?" "Of course," I said, forcing a laugh. "Why wouldn't I be?" He didn't press the issue, but I could feel his eyes on me for the rest of the movie. By the time the credits rolled, my nerves were frayed. "I think I'm going to head to bed," I said, standing up and gathering the empty bowl. Jason didn't say anything, but his gaze followed me as I left the room. I could still feel it on my back as I climbed the stairs, and it lingered long after I had shut the door to my bedroom. The following morning, I decided to create some distance. I busied myself with errands, staying out of the house for as long as possible. But when I returned in the late afternoon, Jason was waiting for me in the kitchen. He was leaning against the counter, his arms crossed, an unreadable expression on his face. "Hey," he said as I walked in, "we need to talk." My heart sank. "About what?" Jason hesitated, then gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down." I obeyed, my hands fidgeting in my lap as I waited for him to speak. "Aunt Claire," he began, his voice soft but steady. "I feel like, I don't know, like something's changed between us." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My stomach churned as I struggled to find a response. "I don't know what you mean," I said finally, though my voice wavered. Jason leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "I think you do." I opened my mouth to protest, but no words came out. The truth was, he was right. Something had changed, and as much as I wanted to deny it, I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced whenever he was near, or the way my thoughts strayed to him at the most inopportune moments. "Jason," I said at last, my voice barely above a whisper. "This, whatever you're thinking, it's not right." "I know," he said, and for the first time he looked uncertain, vulnerable. "But that doesn't make it any less real." The room felt suffocating, the silence stretching on until it was almost unbearable. Finally, I stood, unable to meet his eyes. "I think we need some space," I said. This is too much." Jason didn't argue. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable as he watched me leave the room. But even as I walked away, I knew that space wouldn't fix what was happening. Something had been set into motion, and there was no turning back. The next few days were a strange mix of tension and avoidance. Jason seemed to respect my request for space, but the air between us felt heavier, almost as if an invisible thread still bound us together. Every accidental glance, every brief exchange of words carried a weight that neither of us acknowledged. Richard remained oblivious, as always. He was away more often than not, leaving Jason and me to navigate our unspoken tension in a house that felt far too quiet. It was during these absences that the lines between us began to blur further, despite my best efforts to keep them intact. One particularly humid afternoon, I found myself in the garden, pruning the overgrown bushes that lined the backyard fence. Sweat dripped down my back, and my arms ached from the repetitive motion of cutting branches. I was too focused on the task to notice Jason until he was standing beside me, holding a glass of iced tea. "You look like you could use this," he said, his voice soft but tinged with amusement. I startled slightly but accepted the glass, grateful for the cold relief against my palm. "Thanks," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. Jason leaned against the fence, watching me as I sipped the tea. "You're working too hard," he said after a moment. "You should let me help." "I'm fine," I replied, though the truth was I welcomed the distraction. It's good to keep busy. He didn't press the issue, but after a few moments he picked up the shears I had set down and began trimming the branches himself. I watched him silently, noting the way his muscles flexed with each movement. The sight made my chest tighten in a way that left me both flustered and annoyed with myself. "I can handle it," I said, stepping forward to take the shears back, but Jason held on to them. "Let me," I insisted, his gaze locking onto mine. There was something in his eyes, something intense and unspoken, that made my breath hitch. I nodded, stepping back and pretending to busy myself with gathering the clippings. My hands shook slightly as I worked, and I was acutely aware of Jason's presence just a few feet away. The silence between us felt charged, and I couldn't help but steal glances at him as he worked. When he finally set the shears down, Jason turned to me, his expression softer now. "You don't have to do everything alone, you know," he said quietly. His words caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "I guess I'm just used to it," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Jason stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. "You don't have to be," he said, and there was a tenderness in his tone that made my heart ache. That evening, after Richard had gone to bed, Jason and I found ourselves on the back porch, sipping wine under the glow of the string lights I had hung years ago. The air was warm and heavy with the scent of blooming flowers, and the cicadas hummed softly in the background. "This place is beautiful," Jason said, breaking the comfortable silence. "It feels like home." I smiled, though the word home struck a bittersweet chord in me. "It is," I said, "but sometimes I wonder if it's enough." Jason tilted his head, studying me. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to say the words aloud, but something about the way he looked at me, earnest and unguarded, made me feel safe. "I mean, I love this house, but it feels like I'm just existing here, you know? Like I've lost something along the way." Jason didn't reply immediately. Instead, he reached over and placed his hand over mine, his touch warm and steady. "You haven't lost anything," he said softly. "You're still here, Aunt Claire. You are still amazing." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to my eyes, and I quickly looked away, embarrassed. "You're sweet," I said, trying to deflect the emotion rising in my chest. "It's not just me who thinks so," Jason said, his tone more serious now. "You deserve to feel appreciated, to feel alive." His words hung in the air, and I felt my resolve begin to waver. For the first time in years, I felt seen, truly seen, and it was both exhilarating and terrifying. Over the following days, our bond continued to deepen, though we never addressed the tension directly. We spent more time together, whether it was working on house projects or simply talking late into the night. Each interaction felt like a step closer to something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. One afternoon, while we were repainting the living room, Jason reached over to wipe a smudge of paint from my cheek. His fingers lingered a moment too long, and the look in his eyes made my breath catch. "You've got paint everywhere," he said, his voice low. I laughed nervously, stepping back. "Comes with the territory," I said, though my heart was racing. Jason's gaze didn't waver, and for a moment I thought he might say something else, but instead he simply smiled and went back to painting. The moment passed, but the memory of it lingered, replaying in my mind long after the brushes had been cleaned and the paint cans had been put away. The turning point came one evening when a summer storm rolled in, darkening the sky and sending rain pounding against the windows. Richard was away on another business trip, leaving Jason and me alone in the house. We sat on the couch, watching the rain streak down the glass. The power flickered, casting the room in brief shadows, and the sound of thunder rumbled in the distance. "I've always loved storms," Jason said, his voice soft. "They make everything feel alive." I nodded, my gaze fixed on the rain. "They're beautiful," I said, though my mind was far from the weather outside. The next moment passed in a blur. Jason shifted closer to me, his hand brushing against mine. When I turned to look at him, his eyes were filled with a vulnerability that mirrored my own. "Aunt Claire," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Jason, don't," I said, though I wasn't sure what I was asking him not to do. But Jason didn't stop. "I can't pretend anymore," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I care about you, more than I should." The room seemed tilt, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. "Jason, for me, you're staring polite air. I'm stance. Can't bring my words." "Jason, this is wrong," I murmured, though the conviction in my voice was weak. "I know," he said, his gaze steady, "but I can't help how I feel." I stood abruptly, putting distance between us. "This can't happen," I said, my voice shaking. "You're my nephew." Jason stood as well, his expression pained. "I know it's complicated," he said, "but don't tell me you don't feel it too." I couldn't respond. The truth was, I did feel it. I had felt it for weeks, even as I tried to deny it, but admitting it out loud felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. "I think you should go to bed," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Jason hesitated, his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't give him. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and the storm raging outside. The storm outside hadn't let up, and neither had the turmoil inside me. I spent the night tossing and turning, Jason's words echoing in my mind. I can't pretend anymore. I knew he wasn't just talking about himself. He had exposed something I couldn't ignore any longer, the way I had been pretending too. Pretending that my feelings were innocent. Pretending that this tension between us wasn't real. The morning came with clear skies, but the clarity in my thoughts was nowhere to be found. Jason and I avoided each other for most of the day. He spent hours in his room, and I busied myself with cleaning and errands, trying to keep my mind occupied. But the space didn't ease the tension. It only made it worse. By the evening, I couldn't take the silence any longer. I found Jason in the living room, sitting on the couch with his laptop. He looked up when I entered, his expression guarded. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Jason set the laptop aside and gestured for me to sit. I hesitated before taking a seat on the opposite end of the couch, keeping as much distance as possible between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I'm sorry," he said, finally breaking the silence. "I shouldn't have said anything last night. Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't apologize for being honest." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "Then what are we doing here, Claire?" The way he said my name sent a shiver down my spine. He rarely called me that. It was always Aunt Claire, a reminder of the boundaries that should exist between us. But now, those boundaries felt like they were dissolving before my eyes. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But whatever this is, it has to stop." Jason leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "And if it doesn't?" he asked, his tone quiet but intense. "What if it's already too late?" I couldn't answer. The truth was, it did feel too late. No matter how much I wanted to deny it, the pull between us was undeniable. And as much as I hated myself for it, part of me didn't want to fight it anymore. That night, the line we had danced around for weeks was finally crossed. Richard was still out of town, and the house felt eerily quiet. I had gone to bed early, hoping sleep would give me an escape from my thoughts. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I heard the soft creak of the floorboards outside my room. A moment later, there was a quiet knock at the door. "Claire?" Jason's voice was low, hesitant. I froze, my heart racing. "What is it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. There was a pause, and then the door opened slightly. Jason stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Can we talk?" he asked. I sat up, clutching the edge of the blanket. "Jason, it's late. Please," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Just for a minute." I should have told him to leave. I should have drawn the line firmly and unequivocally, but instead I nodded, and he walked over to sit on the edge of the bed. For a moment we just looked at each other, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Then, before I could think better of it, Jason reached out and took my hand in his. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you want me to leave, I will. But if you feel even half of what I feel..." I didn't stop him. I couldn't. Instead, I let him pull me closer, his touch igniting something in me that I hadn't felt in years. When his lips finally met mine, it was as though a dam had broken, releasing a flood of emotions I had been trying to suppress for weeks. The kiss was slow at first, tentative, as if we were both testing the waters, but it quickly deepened, becoming more urgent, more desperate. Jason's hands moved to my waist, pulling me against him, and I found myself giving in completely. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt wanted, desired, alive. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and secret glances. Jason and I fell into a rhythm of forbidden intimacy, seizing every opportunity to be alone together. When Richard was home, we kept our distance, exchanging only fleeting smiles and subtle touches. But when he was away, the house became our sanctuary, a place where we could exist without judgment or consequence. I knew it couldn't last. Every time I looked at Jason, I was reminded of the lines we had crossed, the trust we were betraying. But the pull between us was too strong, and the thought of ending it felt unbearable. One evening, while Richard was working late, Jason and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen. He had been helping me prepare dinner, and as we stood side by side at the counter, his hand brushed against mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I turned to look at him. Before I could say anything, Jason leaned in, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was both tender and urgent. My resolve crumbled instantly, and I kissed him back, my fingers tangling in his hair. "Claire," he murmured against my lips, his voice filled with longing. "We shouldn't," I said, though my actions betrayed my words. "This is wrong." Jason pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine. "Then why does it feel so right?" he asked. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that in his arms, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. And in that moment, I was willing to risk everything to hold on to that feeling. But the cracks in our secrecy began to show. One afternoon, while Jason and I were sitting on the couch, Richard came home unexpectedly early. We scrambled to put distance between us, but the look Richard gave me as he walked into the room sent a chill down my spine. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he had noticed something he couldn't quite put his finger on. After that, I became more cautious, hyper-aware of every glance, every touch. But the tension between Jason and me was impossible to ignore, and the more we tried to hide it, the more obvious it seemed to become. The breaking point came one evening when Richard suggested we invite Jason to join us for dinner with friends. The idea of sitting across from Jason in public, pretending nothing was going on, filled me with dread, but I had no choice but to agree. The dinner was excruciating. Every time Jason spoke, I felt Richard's eyes on me, as if he was trying to gauge my reaction. By the time we got home, I was a bundle of nerves, and Jason wasn't faring much better. "We can't keep doing this," I said that night, my voice trembling. "Richard's going to figure it out." Jason didn't argue. He simply pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as if he knew our time together was running out. "I don't want to lose you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I clung to him, my heart breaking at the thought of ending what we had, but deep down, I knew he was right. We couldn't keep living in this bubble, pretending the outside world didn't exist. Sooner or later, the truth would come out. And when it did, the fallout would be devastating. The days after the dinner were a waking nightmare. I could feel Richard's suspicion lingering in the air, his gaze sharper than usual, as though he were searching for cracks in our facade. It was subtle, a question here, a lingering look there. But it was enough to make my chest tighten with fear every time we were in the same room. Jason seemed just as unsettled. His usual confidence had been replaced by a nervous energy that made him restless. He avoided Richard when possible, spending long hours out of the house or in his room. When we did find a moment alone, it was rushed and tinged with the unease of knowing we were walking a razor's edge. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when Richard came home unexpectedly. He dropped his briefcase by the door and walked in, his footsteps uncharacteristically heavy. My stomach clenched as I glanced over my shoulder. "You're home early," I said, keeping my voice light. He nodded, leaning against the counter and crossing his arms. "Yeah, thought I'd surprise you." His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it that set me on edge. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Everything okay?" I asked, hoping he couldn't see the tension coiling beneath my skin. Richard shrugged, but his eyes didn't leave mine. "Yeah, just thought we could have dinner together tonight. It's been a while." The words were innocent enough, but the way he said them felt loaded. I nodded, managing a small smile. "That sounds nice." "Good," he said, pushing off the counter. "I'll call Jason, see if he wants to join us." My heart sank. "He might be busy," I said quickly. Too quickly. Richard paused, his brow furrowing. "It's just dinner, Claire." I swallowed hard and nodded again, unable to think of an excuse that wouldn't raise more questions. As Richard walked away, I leaned against the sink, gripping the edge so tightly my knuckles turned white. Dinner that night was a quiet affair, the tension between the three of us palpable. Jason barely looked up from his plate, and I could feel Richard's gaze shifting between us like a predator circling its prey. I tried to make small talk, asking about his work, his day, anything to fill the silence. But Richard's responses were clipped. At one point, Richard turned to Jason, his tone deceptively light. "So Jason, what's keeping you so busy these days?" Jason glanced at me briefly before answering. "Just job hunting, mostly," he said, trying to figure out my next step. Richard nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "That's good. It's important to stay focused." The conversation died again, and I felt like I was suffocating. By the time dinner was over, I could barely keep my hands from trembling as I cleared the table. Jason muttered a quick, "Thank you," before disappearing into his room, leaving me alone with Richard. As I washed the dishes, Richard leaned against the counter, watching me. The weight of his stare made my skin crawl. "Is there something you want to tell me, Claire?" he asked suddenly, his tone calm but pointed. I froze, my hands submerged in the soapy water. "What do you mean?" Richard shrugged, but his eyes were sharp. "You've been acting different lately, distant." I forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to my own ears. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" he asked, his voice dropping. "Because it feels like there's something going on that you're not telling me." I turned off the faucet and dried my hands, keeping my back to him. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Richard didn't reply immediately, and the silence stretched until I thought I might scream. Finally, he sighed and pushed off the counter. "Maybe I am," he said, his tone laced with doubt. "But if there is something, I'd appreciate it if you told me before I find out on my own." The words felt like a warning, and as he walked away, I let out a shaky breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Later that night, Jason knocked softly on my bedroom door. I opened it to find him standing there, his expression "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded and stepped aside to let him in. He closed the door quietly behind him, his shoulders tense. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his words rushing out in a tumble. "Richard knows something's up. I can feel it." "I know," I said, sinking onto the edge of the bed. "I've felt it too." Jason ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. "We have to stop, Claire. Whatever this is, it's not worth it." His words stung, even though I knew he was right. "I don't want to lose you," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're not losing me," he said, stopping to kneel in front of me. "But we can't keep risking everything. It's not fair to anyone." Tears filled my eyes as I nodded, hating the truth in his words. Jason reached out to take my hands, his touch gentle but firm. "I care about you," he said softly. "More than I should, but it has to end." I couldn't bring myself to speak, so I simply nodded again. Jason leaned forward, pressing a lingering kiss to my forehead before standing and walking to the door. "Good night, Claire," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Good night," I whispered, watching as he left the room. The following days were a blur of avoidance and heartbreak. Jason and I kept our distance, speaking only when necessary and keeping our interactions strictly polite. Richard seemed to notice the change, but he didn't comment on it. If anything, he seemed more suspicious, his gaze lingering on me longer than before. I threw myself into housework, trying to fill the void Jason's absence left behind, but no matter how much I scrubbed or organized, I couldn't shake the ache in my chest. The house felt emptier than ever, and I found myself longing for the moments we had shared, even as I knew they had been wrong. Jason, for his part, seemed to be preparing for his departure. He spent hours in his room, sorting through his belongings and making phone calls. One evening, he mentioned casually that he had a lead on a job in another city. The news hit me like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to smile and congratulate him. "That's great," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I'm happy for you." Jason nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thanks," he said. "It's probably for the best." I didn't respond, unable to find the words. Instead, I turned away, blinking back tears as I busied myself with folding laundry. The day Jason left, the house felt like it was holding its breath. He packed his car in the early morning, and I stood on the porch watching as he loaded the last of his boxes. Richard had left for work already, leaving the two of us alone for a final goodbye. Jason walked over to me, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I guess this is it," he said, his voice soft. I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward and pulled me into a tight hug. I clung to him, my heart breaking all over again. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And be happy, okay?" I nodded against his shoulder, unable to say anything more. When he finally pulled away, he gave me a small, sad smile before climbing into his car and driving away. As I watched him disappear down the street, the weight of everything we had done and everything we had lost settled over me like a heavy blanket. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the empty house pressing in around me, and wondered if I would ever feel whole again. The house was quieter than ever after Jason left. The emptiness felt tangible, stretching into every corner like an unwelcome guest. I busied myself with chores, errands, and anything else that could distract me from the ache in my chest. But no amount of activity could fill the void he left behind. The house that once felt warm and lively now seemed like a hollow shell. Richard, however, seemed more attentive than usual. His previously absent demeanor shifted, and he started coming home earlier, asking more questions about my day and watching me with a careful intensity that made my skin crawl. I couldn't tell if it was guilt or paranoia, but I felt like I was living under a microscope. It was late one evening when the discovery finally happened. I had just finished cleaning up after dinner when Richard walked into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. I felt a flicker of unease as he leaned against the doorframe, his eyes fixed on me. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and steady. My stomach dropped. "What about?" Richard gestured to the small table in the corner. "Sit." I hesitated but obeyed, wiping my hands on a dish towel as I took a seat. Richard sat across from me, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "I've been noticing some things," he began, his tone careful. "Things that don't add up." I forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "What are you talking about?" Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled out his phone and placed it on the table between us. My breath caught as he unlocked it and slid it toward me. "Explain this," he said. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a photo of Jason and me, sitting on the back porch one evening. It wasn't incriminating, we were simply sitting close, sharing a bottle of wine, but there was something about the way Jason was looking at me, the way my hand rested on his arm, that sent a chill down my spine. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Does it matter?" Richard shot back. "What matters is what it looks like. So tell me, Claire, what exactly was going on between you and Jason?" I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of his accusation hung in the air, and I felt like I was drowning. Finally, I managed to speak. "There's nothing going on," I said, though the lie felt weak even to my own ears. "It's not what it looks like." Richard laughed bitterly, leaning back in his chair. "Not what it looks like," he repeated. "Then why does it look like my wife and my nephew were getting a little too close for comfort?" I swallowed hard, my hands twisting in my lap. "Jason was going through a tough time," I said. "We were just talking, that's all." "Talkin'?" Richard said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You expect me to believe that?" "It's the truth," I said, my voice rising in desperation. "You're reading too much into this." Richard's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked like he was about to explode. But then he stood abruptly, pacing the kitchen like a caged animal. "You know what hurts the most," he said, his voice strained. "It's not even the idea that you cheated. It's the fact that you think I'm stupid enough to believe your lies." "I didn't cheat," I said, my voice shaking. "I swear to you, Richard, nothing happened." He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his eyes blazing with anger. "Do you think I haven't noticed the way you've been acting, the way you've been avoiding me, the way you look when his name comes up? You think I'm blind?" I couldn't speak. The truth was clawing at my throat, desperate to escape, but I couldn't bring myself to admit it, not when it would destroy everything. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Richard said, his voice deadly calm. "Did something happen between you and Jason?" The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. My mind raced, weighing the consequences of the truth against the already fragile state of our marriage. Finally, I shook my head. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing happened." Richard stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, though there was no relief in his eyes. "Fine," he said, "but don't think for a second that I believe." With that, he He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me sitting there, trembling and alone. The confrontation left a lingering tension in the house that refused to dissipate. Richard barely spoke to me, his silence more damning than any accusation. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. One afternoon, I went into Richard's office to find some paperwork and noticed his laptop open on the desk. The screen displayed an email chain between him and his brother, Jason's father. My heart sank as I read the subject line, Jason's behavior at Claire's house. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the messages. Richard had been corresponding with his brother for weeks, voicing his suspicions and piecing together Jason's actions during his stay. The most recent email was the most damning. I don't have solid proof, but I know something happened. The way they acted around each other, the way she's been since he left, it all adds up. Jason's avoiding my calls, and Claire won't give me a straight answer. I need to know the truth. My blood ran cold. Richard was determined to uncover the truth, and it was only a matter of time before he did. I closed the laptop and left the room, my mind racing. I knew I had to do something, anything, to keep the fragile threads of my life from unraveling completely. That evening, as Richard sat in the living room, I approached him cautiously. He looked up, his expression We need to talk, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Richard nodded, setting down the newspaper he had been pretending to read. I'm listening. I took a deep breath, gathering my courage. I know things have been tense lately, I began, and I know you have questions, but I need you to trust me when I say that nothing happened between Jason and me. Richard's eyes narrowed, and I could see the doubt etched into his features. You expect me to trust you after everything I've seen? I do, I said, my voice firm, because I love you, Richard, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. He studied me for a long moment, his expression softening just slightly. If that's true, he said, then you need to prove it. Tell me how, I said, desperation creeping into my voice. Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. I want full transparency, no more secrets, no more lies. If you're hiding anything, now's the time to come clean. I nodded, though my heart ached at the weight of his words. Okay, I said. No more secrets. It was a promise I wasn't sure I could keep, but in that moment, it was the only thing I had left to offer. The fragile truce I had brokered with Richard felt like walking on a crumbling ledge. Every interaction, every conversation was weighted with his quiet suspicion and my overwhelming guilt. The promises I had made to him replayed in my mind constantly. No more secrets. It was a lie I had no idea how to sustain. Days passed in a haze of tension. Richard became increasingly distant, though his silence felt like an interrogation in itself. He wasn't asking questions outright, but I could feel them lurking beneath his every look, every pause in conversation. Meanwhile, my thoughts were consumed with Jason, his voice, his touch, his absence. The breaking point came late one night. Richard had gone to bed hours earlier, leaving me alone in the living room. I sat on the couch, staring at my phone. My fingers hovered over Jason's number, the urge to hear his voice almost unbearable. I knew it was reckless, but the ache in my chest made me feel desperate, irrational. I just needed to know he was okay. Before I could stop myself, I dialed the number. It rang twice before Jason picked up. Claire? He said, his voice groggy but laced with concern. Hi, I whispered, my voice trembling. I'm sorry to call so late. I needed to hear your voice. There was a long pause on the other end, and I could hear Jason exhale softly. Are you okay? No, I admitted, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Everything's falling apart, Jason. Richard, He knows something's wrong. He's watching me all the time, and I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Jason sighed, his voice heavy with regret. "Claire, I told you this would happen. That's why I left. It's better this way." "Better?" I repeated, my voice breaking. "It doesn't feel better. It feels like I'm drowning." "You'll get through this," Jason said firmly. "You're stronger than you think." Before I could respond, I heard the soft creak of floorboards behind me. I turned, my heart dropping into my stomach as I saw Richard standing in the doorway. His face was shadowed, but the look in his eyes was unmistakable. "But who are you talking to?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. I fumbled with the phone, ending the call and setting it down on the coffee table. "It's nothing," I stammered. "Just—" "Don't lie to me," Richard snapped, stepping closer. "You were talking to him, weren't you?" "Richard, please," I said, standing up and holding out my hands as though to placate him. "It's not what you think." "Oh, it's exactly what I think," he said, his voice rising. "You couldn't even wait for me to go to bed before calling him, could you?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Richard's expression twisted into one of disgust as he shook his head. "How long?" he demanded. "How long has this been going on?" "There's nothing going on," I said weakly, though the lie sounded feeble even to me. Richard let out a bitter laugh. "You expect me to believe that? After everything I've seen, after what I just heard?" I could feel the walls closing in around me, the weight of my choices crashing down like a tidal wave. "Richard, I swear—" "Enough," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "I deserve the truth, Claire. For once, just tell me the damn truth." The words spilled out before I could stop them. "We didn't sleep together," I said, my voice trembling. "But yes, there was something. It was a mistake, Richard. I was lonely and—" "A mistake?" he interrupted, his voice dripping with bitterness. "Is that what you're calling it? A mistake? You let my nephew, my own flesh and blood, come into our home and—" He broke off, pacing the room like a caged animal. His hands raked through his hair as he tried to process what I had just admitted. "I can't believe this," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "I can't believe you would do this to us." "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "I never meant for this to happen. I love you, Richard. I do." He turned to me, his eyes blazing with fury and hurt. "Don't you dare say that," he spat. "Don't you dare tell me you love me after what you've done." The venom in his words cut deep, but I couldn't blame him. I had betrayed him in the worst way possible, and no amount of apologies could undo the damage I had caused. The confrontation stretched late into the night, Richard's anger ebbing and flowing like a storm. He alternated between shouting and silence, his emotions raw and unfiltered. I tried to explain myself, to offer some semblance of an excuse, but everything I said only seemed to make things worse. By the time he stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him, I was left alone in the wreckage of what had once been our marriage. The silence was deafening, the weight of my actions pressing down on me like a physical force. I sat on the couch, my head in my hands, wondering how it had come to this, how I had let my life spiral so far out of control. The answer was simple and yet devastating. I had let myself believe, for just a moment, that I could have something more, that I could feel alive again, and when Richard returned hours later, his face was grim but composed. He didn't speak to me, didn't even look at me as he walked past and went upstairs. The distance between us felt insurmountable, a chasm that could never be bridged. The following days were a blur of cold, stilted conversations and avoidance. Richard stayed out late, coming home only to sleep, while I threw myself into meaningless tasks to keep my mind from spiraling. The house felt like a tomb, each room echoing with the ghosts of what we had lost. I knew things would never be the same. Even if Richard chose to stay, our marriage was fractured beyond repair. The trust we had built over years was gone, replaced by suspicion and resentment, and as much as I wanted to believe we could rebuild, a part of me knew the truth. Some things, once broken, could never be mended. The days that followed were suffused with an unbearable stillness. Richard's absence felt louder than his presence ever had. He came and went as though we were strangers living under the same roof. When he spoke, his words were clipped, distant, designed to cut without leaving visible wounds. The weight of his disdain hung in the air, choking any attempts I might have made to repair the damage. I spent hours replaying our life together in my mind, every shared laugh, every quiet moment of comfort. How had it come to this? When had we stopped seeing each other, really seeing each other? I wanted to blame Richard for the emotional void I had fallen into, but deep down I knew this wasn't just his fault. I had made the choices that led us here. Jason's absence, too, was a hollow ache that refused to fade. I had deleted his number from my phone, knowing it was the only way to keep myself from making another mistake. But it didn't stop the memories from creeping in, the stolen glances, the quiet moments when I had felt more alive than I had in years. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, Richard walked in. I didn't look up, keeping my focus on the soapy water swirling in the sink, but I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and unreadable. "Claire," he said, his voice breaking the silence. I turned slowly, drying my hands on a towel. "Yes?" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking," he said finally, "about everything." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure if I was ready for whatever he was about to say. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he admitted, his voice raw. "I don't know if I even want to, but I think we owe it to ourselves to try." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, both a lifeline and a sentencing. I blinked back tears, unsure if they were of relief or sorrow. "I want to try," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't want to lose you, Richard." He nodded, though the pain in his eyes told me this was far from a reconciliation. It was the barest of olive branches, a chance to see if the wreckage could be salvaged. As the days turned to weeks, Richard and I began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. It wasn't easy. Every interaction felt like walking on eggshells, every conversation laced with unspoken tension. But I clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Still, in the quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, I couldn't help but wonder if we were simply prolonging the inevitable. Some scars, after all, never truly heal. The silence in the house grew heavier with each passing day, like a weight pressing down on both Richard and me. Though he had said he wanted to try, the distance between us felt insurmountable. Every glance carried an unspoken accusation, every word a reminder of the shattered trust that now defined our marriage. The hope I had clung to, the hope that we could rebuild, was beginning to feel like a cruel illusion. One evening, Richard came home later than usual. I was sitting in the living room, absently flipping through a magazine I wasn't reading. When I heard the door open, I looked up to see him standing there, his face shadowed and weary. He didn't say a word as he walked past me and into the kitchen. I listened as he opened the fridge, the sound of bottles clinking together breaking the oppressive silence. Finally, I got up and followed him, unsure of what I was hoping to accomplish. Richard stood at the counter, a beer in hand, staring out the window into the darkened backyard. For a moment, I hesitated, but then I stepped closer. "Richard," I said softly, my voice almost trembling. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "What is it, Claire?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. I need to know where we stand." Richard sighed heavily, setting the beer down on the counter. He crossed his arms and leaned back against the counter, studying me with a mix of exhaustion and resignation. "Where we stand?" he repeated, as if testing the words. "That's a good question." I felt my chest tighten, the ache of uncertainty clawing at me. "I know I hurt you," I said, my voice trembling. "And I know it's going to take time, but I need to know if there's a chance for us." Richard looked away, his jaw tightening. For a long moment he didn't speak, and the silence stretched unbearably. Finally he turned back to me, his eyes filled with a pain I could hardly bear to see. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." His words cut deep, but I knew they were deserved. I had broken something fundamental between us, and there were no guarantees it could ever be repaired. "But I'm willing to try," he continued, his voice quieter now, "because I think we owe it to ourselves to see if we can make it work." The fragile hope in his words brought tears to my eyes. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I want to try too," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Richard gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before picking up his beer and leaving the kitchen. I stood there for a long time, the quiet settling around me like a heavy blanket. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act. Richard and I moved through our days cautiously, like strangers trying to navigate unfamiliar terrain. We avoided talking about Jason, the unspoken topic that hung between us like a specter. I knew he was still struggling with what had happened, and I didn't push him to talk about it. The wounds were too fresh, too raw. I threw myself into the routine of daily life, hoping that the mundane rhythms of cooking, cleaning, and errands could somehow piece together the broken fragments of our marriage. But no matter how hard I tried, the sense of normalcy eluded me. Every room in the house felt haunted by memories of Jason, of the choices I had made, of the person I had become. One evening, I decided to go through the attic. It was a space I rarely ventured into, filled with old boxes and forgotten relics from a life that seemed impossibly distant. I told myself I was just organizing, but in truth, I was looking for something, anything, that could help me make sense of the mess I had created. As I sifted through the boxes, I came across an old photo album. I sat down on the dusty floor, flipping through the pages slowly. The photos were a time capsule of happier days, vacations, birthdays, holidays spent with family. I lingered on a photo of Richard and me from our honeymoon, both of us smiling brightly, the joy in our eyes unmistakable. I felt a pang of longing as I stared at the image, wondering if we could ever find our way back to that version of ourselves. The woman in the photo felt like a stranger to me now, so full of hope and certainty, so sure of the path ahead. I wanted to believe she was still in me somewhere, buried beneath the mistakes and regrets. Later that night, as Richard and I sat in the living room watching television, I turned to him. "Do you remember our honeymoon?" I asked, my voice soft. Richard glanced at me, surprised by the question. "Of course," he said. "Why?" I shrugged, trying to keep my tone casual. "I found some old photos today. It just made me think about how happy we were back then." Richard was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting back to the television. "A lot's changed since then," he said finally. I nodded, my chest tightening. "I know, but maybe we can find a way to get some of that back." Richard didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told me he was at least considering the possibility. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the days turned into weeks, the tentative truce between us began to solidify. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of tension, of doubt, of lingering resentment, but slowly we started to rebuild. We went to counseling, each session peeling back another layer of hurt and mistrust. It was painful, but it was also necessary. Jason, meanwhile, remained a ghost in our lives. Richard never mentioned him, and I avoided the subject entirely. I didn't know where he was or what he was doing, and I forced myself not to look. The temptation was always there, but I knew that reaching out would only open old wounds. One evening, as Richard and I sat on the back porch watching the sunset, he reached over and took my hand. The gesture was small, but it felt monumental. I looked at him, and for the first time in months, I saw a glimmer of the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. "We've been through a lot," he said quietly, "but I think we're going to be okay." I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. "I hope so," I said. "I really do." The future was uncertain, and I knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. But in that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and Richard's hand held mine, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we